just ask you, I'm supposed to finish by 6:40, right?
And have some time for Q&A if required.
Right. So I'll finish at 6:40.
Right. But yesterday also we had to stretch the starting time by a couple of minutes because, I mean, a large number of people were trying to get in and they were not able to. And then finally we decided to start it off anyway. So the moment we hit the 2:50, we will start it, sir.
Okay, very good. Don't forget that 2 minutes in Bombay is very different from 2 minutes in Shillong.
Absolutely, especially in the evenings. So
your Kakoti is a name from Maharashtra or from?
I know Mr. Gopalakrishnan is extremely particular about time and schedule. Extremely particular. I know him for long years, so I should start now. And just give me a minute. I'll for the benefit of the students and the participants, I'll just give a brief introduction to the eminence distinguished speaker today with us in our evening session on the second day of the Suscon, 8th edition of Suscon. Mr. R. Gopalakrishnan. He has been a corporate leader for 53 years, 31 years in Unilever and 17 years in Tata. He served in Jeddah as chairman of Unilever Arabia, in Bangalore as managing director of Brook Bond Lipton and vice chairman of Hindustan Liver and director of Tata Sons. Apart from serving as a director of the Tata parent board, Tata Sons, and he serves as an independent director and non-executive chairman of Castrol India and also an independent director of Press Trust of India. He's actively engaged in both instructional and inspirational speaking. He has authored 12 books by now. Some of the books I enjoyed personally. The first I wrote him back also. I remember that after reading his first book, probably the first book, if I'm not wrong, sir, correct me. The case of the bonsai manager, wonderful. It gave me a lot of insights that time, long time back. And I happened to know him for long years. He's like my elder brother to me. When I asked him very recently, sir, what are you doing? He answered in Bengali, Ami ajkal gyan diye barai. That means I transmit knowledge these days. So this is an honor and delight for us to have with us, this evening on Suscon 8, Mr. R. Gopalakrishnan. Sir, the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to IIM Shillong for inviting me. But more importantly, I would like to compliment IIM Shillong that you are not only running a program for sustainability, but engaging the young students, because the time when I grew up as a manager is obviously going to be different from the time you all are going to grow up as managers. And sustainability will probably be a very key subject, like digitalization is happened in the last 30 years. So I compliment IIM Shillong, and I hope all of you will not take this as some flaky subject which your old-fashioned professors have designed for you, but as probably the most vital subject that will guide your career and life. So in that sense, and sustainability means many things to many people. It has multiple dimensions. It's like a shining diamond. If you go to the Kolar gold fields in Karnataka, you'll find diamonds there. Gold, you find gold there, but you get diamonds in some places. And if you chisel it, you get different facets of the diamond. And I want to speak about one aspect of the diamond, which brings sustainability close to corporations and companies, because that intersection is what y'all are interested in. I'm just not going to define sustainability. A lot of eclectic speakers I found in your program. And 1 minute, let me just, have I got a gallery view? Ah, um, I found a lot of eclectic speakers on your program. I'm defining sustainability as running an enterprise with sustainability and long life, right? That is a simple definition. That requires you to take care of all stakeholders. It requires you to take care of the environment in which you're operating. Requires you to engage in the community in which your factories or operations are located. It requires you to take care of your employees, its shareholders. So I'm defining sustainability in a much broader way. And the title I've chosen to talk to you today about is called Creating a Firm That is Respected and Loved. And I have been a very lucky fellow during my life and career that I worked for two wonderful companies, Unilever and Tata. And I spent 31 years in Unilever and 17 years in Tata. So 48 years in two of India's finest companies, or amongst the finest companies, who are very conscious of sustainability. So I can really talk from experience rather than theory. And I want to talk to you till 6:40. It is now approaching 6:10, so say half an hour. And I've got lots of things to tell you, but I must resist the temptation to go on and on. And I want to focus uh, my I'm not going to use any charts, by the way. So if you want to take notes, you can take notes, or it is anyway going to be recorded and it will be available to you. Uh, Three parts, three questions I'm going to answer. The first question I'm going to try to answer is the birth of a company in a national economy like the birth of a child in a family? Is the birth of a company in a national economy like the birth of a child in a family? The second question I want to address is, what does respect and love mean when it is applied to a company? When it's applied to a child or a family, it's fairly clear. You don't need a lecture from me. And the third question I would try to touch upon is, what is it that I have learned? Can I tell some stories? And I've got lots of stories, but I'll tell two or three stories from my experience. So I don't intend to rush through. I have no curriculum to finish. If somebody feels that what I'm saying is not very clear, then you're welcome to, I don't know, raise your hand or do whatever your professors have told you to do, or put it in the chat box. And I'm willing to address that question. It's more important for me to be engaged with you than to give you a bhashan. If you want to hear bhashan, you can hear Man Ki Baat on Sunday morning. But I'm talking to you not as a bhashan, but I want to engage you. And to be engaged, you must have the chance to ask a question. If I'm unclear, don't ask a question just for the heck of it or just to show that you're engaged. But I like to talk to young people because they are curious and because they ask you questions that may seem silly to you, but which are actually very clever. And that's why I'm associated here in Bombay with the SP Jain Institute of Management. and I spend a fair amount of my time with young people, apart from my grandchildren and so on, you know. But my grandchildren are not yet studying in a B school, so you will have interesting things to ask. So let's take the first question. Is the birth of a company like the birth of a child? Do you mind if I sort of ask you to, I'll call out a name of whoever is the victim whose name comes in front of me and just ask him to comment. What do you think, Santoshi? Santoshi Nair, is it? Naidu.
Good evening, sir.
What do you think? Do you think the birth of a company in a society is like the birth of a child in a family?
Yeah, yes, sir. I think like that only because the birth of a company means it's like a combining of our ideas, new things will get into the society. And so I do feel like birth of a company is like.
And Akash Mollik, what do you think? When you read
Good
about
evening. Good
Zomato
evening, sir.
having a value, good evening. When you read about Zomato having a valuation of 160,000, 100,000 crores, it doesn't feel like it's a child in the family, no, who's grown up.
Yeah, sir, we can say that, but it is not actually a child. It is there from a significant amount of time. It is just going public now.
Yeah, but it's 5 years old, huh?
Yes, sir.
I mean,
It is.
if your daughter or son, none of you has a daughter or a son probably yet, but if a daughter or a son came into first standard and got a valuation of 100,000 crores, would you be happy with you think that child will be raised properly?
No, sir. There is something wrong with it for sure.
Well, there's some cause for caution. I'm not saying something wrong. I'm not saying Zomato is a bad.
No, I am not saying. I
Yeah.
was just saying that it is overestimated. I think.
So one of the good things to remember is that just like in a child, if you start heaping high value to the child, बेटा तुम बहुत smart है, तुम first आता है, तुमको gold medal मिला, let's have a party to celebrate with all my family. If the child becomes conscious that he or she is exceptional, then the performance of that child later in life declines. This is your common sense also. But I've got research evidence of that. I'm not going to go into the research evidence. So you must give encouragement, but that is different from too much praise. Correct? That's what your father and mother and grandfather and all do. And if you came first in class, I remember my grandfather would say, okay, what did you not do well in? Oh, in Hindi, you got only 40 out of 100. You must try to get 45. You know, he would be pushing you. And in the world of sports, you find that some people, I don't know how many of you are followers of tennis, but if you remember a player called Jennifer Capriati, at the age of 14, she came into the finals of a Grand Slam, and everybody said this is the next big thing after sliced bread. Poor thing got so much attention and pressure that she destroyed her career. Even more recently, you'll find there's a girl called Naomi Osaka. And if you follow tennis, you would have heard of Naomi Osaka. And there's a very nice film on Netflix called Naomi Osaka, which you can see. I mean, she's 18 years old or 19 years old. She won a Wimbledon and Grand Slam, and then there's so much attention put on her that she gets into a depression. You heard of Deepika Padukone getting into depression, right? So I think what happens to human beings happens to companies also. Disproportionately high attention too soon is a danger signal. It doesn't mean the company is finished, but it's a danger signal. And I have found there's some similarities between a company and a child or a human being. I've traveled in many countries now. I've run through so many passports which are now thick. In many countries, most countries except for Soviet Union or China, 70% of the companies or 80% of the companies are family-owned companies. The company is an economic institution, but the families run it. So it's also a social institution. That's why you hear these stories about family companies. Now, in a family, whether you're a business family or a professional family or a lawyer's family or a politician's family, the birth of a child is a very special occasion. And entrepreneurs who set up companies must realize that when they form a company, that's like giving birth to a child. right? And they have to therefore have the attitude of giving to that child the same care and attention to detail that a parent gives to his or her child. Um, Now, what's happened in the last 30, 40 years is because of the explosion of the technology space, many companies are reaching staggering valuations in a very short time. It's like a family which is producing babies who at the age of 5 can recite Shakespeare. At the age of 10, they can tell you the Vedas and the Upanishads. Uh, those kinds of people unfortunately die at 30. Srinivas Ramanujam, Swami Vivekananda, brilliant people, but God gives them intense intellectual capability in a very short time. And yet, in our families, when a child is born, the grandmother always says, Dirghayush Bhava, stay, live long. You just take the US market, three companies: Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. The market cap of these three companies put together is three times India's GDP. Let me repeat it. The market cap of three companies, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, is three times India's market cap. India's market cap meaning India's GDP. That's a staggering amount of value which they have earned. And if the number is $6.5 trillion, I don't know if you want to later on sit with 6.5 trillion, multiply, put the zeros and see how many crores it is. $6.5 trillion is the market value of these three companies. India is $2.5 trillion, depending on which last data you saw. So if we are to become, as India, forget about the companies, 6.5 trillion, it will take us till at least 2035. And y'all will be around, I won't be around at that time. But by that time, you will find that these three companies have become $12 trillion. Or they would have collapsed. I don't know what will happen. I'm not predicting. So the valuation of a company like Flipkart or Zomato is very much in the news now, is already crossing the market cap of well-established companies which have been there for a very long time. So we are seeing a very new phenomenon. The point to remember is whether it's America or India or China, we are seeing a very new phenomenon that the new children that are being born, if I use the metaphor of the baby in the family, are growing far more rapidly. So when your son is 10 years old, he's 7 feet tall. And when he's 20, he's 10 feet tall. And the parents look like dwarfs. So we are creating a very new type of company. How sustainable they'll be, I don't know. Because the dinosaur was also like that. It kept growing and growing and growing, and then the species got extinct for reasons which are not that clear. Now, there are four factors in interplay, and I will just mention the four, and then I would like to focus on this point about being loved and respected. First, the general attitude of investors is the growth expectation from these new children is very high because they get very big valuation in very short time. So it's like a family where they expect every daughter to grow up to be 7.5 feet tall, be a top class basketball player. You may even create a pressure on the girls who are born if they are little less than 7.5 feet that they are no good, or the men, the boys. The second is the older members of the family seem to be getting, relatively speaking, they are not less vigorous. I don't think Tata or Lever is less vigorous, but they seem to be appearing less vigorous compared to the children who are born in the family. Third is there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity about how this valuation is arrived at, because it is being driven by very few people, 1% of the population of the world, who own more than 60% of the wealth of the world. So it is like, I don't know, Malabar Hill in Bombay, where property prices are determined not by plain Joe, but by a few people maybe 1% of Bombay residents who can afford to even step into Malabar Hill, let alone buy a flat. Right? And last, of course, I have already pointed this out. Too much money and too much valuation too soon has a tendency to corrode traditional values. And it reframes the societal and moral basis of society. Now, this is the last point, is the one I want to touch upon, because that's what's relevant to Suscon. And why I agreed to speak to you, because when Sanjay rang me up, I said, I would like to tell young people to think about a subject. I'm not preaching. I'm not telling you what's right and wrong. That's, I want you to think about it, because you're at the beginning of your program. And I think it is something, since your institute has taken the trouble to arrange all this, gives you food for thought. The fact of the matter is that within the same species, I mean, these new companies are not a different species, they are the same species. A, a genetically modified company is coming up, which is able to go through a, but its birth and death cycle is the same. It will be born, it will become an infant, it will become an adolescent, it will become mature, and then it will also die or be consumed or whatever, just like a human being. So I think the point I want to emphasize is, just like my grandfather or my great grandfather, whom I have not met, was shorter than my grandfather, and my grandfather was shorter than my father, and I am taller than my father. There's a generational shift happening in the type of companies that are being born. But that doesn't mean that the rules of life have changed. It is important to understand that Ayurveda is 2000 years old. I don't know, maybe more than 2000 years old. And the rules of long life, good health, happiness have not changed for 2000 years. The same thing is packaged and repackaged and remarketed, and people interpret it differently. But Ayurveda has been there for a long time. If you go to Japan, Ikigai has been there for a very long time. And the principles of longevity have been a source of fascination for human beings for a very long time. So I want to leave you with the idea that a company, while in legal terms it's an inanimate object, if you ask a lawyer, that's what he will tell you. But as a social body, as part of society, a company is a live thing, and it's got many of the characteristics of human beings. And now anything which has got characteristics of human beings is not just a rational thing, but it's an emotional thing also. And companies have rationality and emotion. That's the first part I want to make. First point I want to make in the first section, that is the birth of a company like the birth of a child. Second, I told you I'd like to address a question. If the company is like a child, like a human being, um, is it possible to respect and love a company? I want you all, I'm going to go around and, if you don't mind, pick up people at random, the names and faces I see. And you can please unmute yourself and answer. Or if somebody wants to volunteer, just put up your hand, if I can see it. Can you tell me the name of companies that you respect? Vishaka.
Yeah, hi, sir. So, yes, of course, like Tata's, the way.
You made me very happy, but tell me, other than Tata and Lever. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me think. In the meantime, maybe.
Okay,
yeah.
no problem. 5 participants have raised their hand, but I don't know who they are. But can you speak up, unmute? Hemant Singh, I think, is one person.
Yeah, good evening, sir. Hemant this side.
Yeah.
So the company I respect the most is Apple.
Apple. Okay, that's it. That's it. You don't have to tell me the reasons why. You respect Apple a lot. Any other company? One more company you can mention?
Not the company, but the brand of Nike, the Jordan Air Jordan brand of Nike. I respect that brand.
Okay. Anybody else wants to make Mahalakshmi? Did you want to make a contribution?
Hello, sir. Good evening. I respect Google
Google.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else wants to say anything?
So I
Yeah,
would say
hello.
for hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Anmol here.
Tanmoy.
Anmol, Anmol.
Anmol, okay.
Sir, I would say I would love to means like to respect the brand like a Geo, which provided the free data for 6 months. So,
Okay. So Geo. So you
Sir,
respect. We got companies: Apple, Google, uh, Geo. Okay, we got three. Two are abroad and one is here. Do you love a company, Isha? Can you love a company?
Uh,
can I add one
Possibly.
thing?
Let Ishan speak. I'll
Yeah.
come back to you, Tanmoy.
Possibly, sir. When you say love a company, it could be either love its products or
Whatever it is,
service.
you just tell me, can you love? If I ask you, can you love a girl? You don't
Yes.
say, is it her looks or is it her
Yes,
height
sir.
or weight?
Yes, sir. It is possible to love a company.
Tell me a company you love.
Other than Tata's, I'd say I have a huge respect for Wipro.
But respect
Because,
and love are different.
sorry, sir.
Respect and love are different, aren't they?
Okay. Love. I can't think of any.
Okay, not to worry. Tanmoy,
Yeah, sir. I started a company in my final year, so I would say I love that company. My company.
which one?
I started a company in my final year of my
Ah,
graduation.
your,
So
your own
yeah,
company.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And sir, I want to add one more thing. Like
Ah,
I'm from Nehru. I don't like whether you would relate or
your what?
not. Nehru Hall of Residence.
Okay, पढ़ा लिखा आदमी IIT खड़गपुर का है.
So you are from like.
Okay, good. Anvita, did you want to say something? Did I hear you see you put up your hand? Go
Yes,
ahead.
sir. Sir, I love
Yeah.
Lamborghini. That's my favorite company. Yeah.
Lamborghini. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now you see, firstly, you would have noticed that people are able to think of companies that they respect far more easily. When it comes to loving a company, there are खींच के निकालना पड़ता है, right? Like a dentist will pull out your teeth. Why is that so? And all the people you said you respect are bachas. Tanmoy said he started a company that must be 2, 3, 4 years old. Geo is also 5, 6 years old. Google, Amazon और 10 साल 20 साल के बच्चे हैं, 25 साल के हैं. Whereas when it came to love, people were saying Tata, which is 100 years old. How come you love old people and respect young people? Have you thought about it? Because the person you're loving is going to die very soon. Because you're not able to, the guy doesn't last long enough for you to name as a person you love. So if I say to a young man, who do you love? And he keeps mentioning grandmother, auntie, neighbor's grandmother. I say, who do you respect? And he mentions their granddaughter. Isn't there something funny? Rather strange, no? Suraj?
Yeah, it's strange.
Now, I want you to think about it. I am not, there's no perfect answer for it. It's not difficult to imagine why somebody loves the company he set up. I love my little sons. If there's a son born in your house tomorrow, you'll love the son. Of course, that's natural and you should. The point is this, and this is what I want to leave with you to think about. When somebody lives very long, like a dadu or a granddadu in your house, then you wonder what makes him live so long, right? Typically, if you have somebody who's past 80, 85, 90, you say, and he will tell you not to be tense and this and that and so on and so forth. Some of the lessons are. But I have studied long living companies, Dirghayush Bhava companies from Japan, from Europe, and from America. When I say I've studied, I have acquired books of researchers who've studied these type of companies, and I have those books. I have a little library, and I've written my own book on Indian companies. And I have found that they all adduce to a formula which I call TACC. If you do TACC, these companies are all T is for tolerant. They are not at all intolerant. While they may say I'm in the FMCG business, or they may say this is their policy, they will also experiment on the side. So since I was a director of Tata Sons, I can tell you, we said our core business is steel, but somebody said, why not we make trucks? And we said, oh, why not make trucks? Then somebody else said, why not make software? Not at the same time, at different times. And so we've done software. This is what I mean by tolerance. So it is like saying, I love my native language, Tamil, but I'm very tolerant for Manipuri language or Assamese language. I may not know it, but I'm very tolerant. I'm interested to know. And therefore, when you travel as a sales manager or something, you, at least I was very lucky to get a chance to understand different cultures of India and different languages of India, and see different aspects of India. That's what I mean by tolerant. One of the great characteristics of India is it has nothing to do with BJP, UPA, Congress, all these guys, but it's our tradition that we are a very tolerant society. And it is a matter on which all of us should be proud. India has lasted for a 5,000 year civilization. At the time the Indus Valley civilization was going on, or the Vedic civilization was going on, its counterparts in the other parts of the world was the Pharaonic civilization in Egypt. You had the Greek civilization going on in Greece. Um, you had the Mesopotamian civilization in what is today called Iraq. And none of them exists in that form anymore. You can't find a pharaoh if you go to Cairo. You won't find a Mesopotamian Nebuchadnezzar sitting in Baghdad. And you won't find an Aristotle. You may find a human being called Socrates, but he will be nothing Socratic about him. But in India, we still follow Vedic traditions. As an example, I'm not making a virtue out of Vedic traditions, but it's been there unchanged for 4,000 years. So this comes out of tolerance. Tolerance is a very great virtue. And when you're in a company, you must ensure that there are tolerance at the edges, focus in the core. Tolerance at the edges, focus in the core. The second one is adaptive. TACC, I told you. A stands for adaptive. And adaptive really means you can change with the times. Your Brahma Mantra is not changing, but the manifestation of how the Brahma Mantra is practiced will change. So that's adaptive. C is for coherent. And coherent means you got a very clear identity कि मैं कौन हूँ, who am I? Why am I doing what I'm doing? I'm coherent, right? India has been multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-everything, multi-racial, multi-culture for 4,000 years. It's nothing to do with Gandhiji or Nehru or Modi or anything else. If anything, these people might have encouraged it or destroyed it, but that's not the subject of our discussion. So coherence of who an Indian is deep within our tradition. And last C is conservative. They are not Rambo people. Now, if I look at companies and apply TACC, Tata and Levers, I'll keep to those two because they are in my experience. Tata is a highly tolerant company. Tolerant doesn't mean people see tolerant as a vice, not a virtue. कि वो सब कुछ चलता है. No, tolerant means you're allowing multiple ideas. The physicist Neil Bohr had made a statement that we assume in our life that the opposite of a truth is a falsehood. But he said the opposite of a truth can be another truth. Unless you have the mind of a scientist, and scientists are required not only in science, but in humanities, in arts, in management, in human relations, the ability to be a skeptic and question, you cannot be tolerant. So when you get into a company, remember, you must have an opinion of your own, but you must be tolerant of another point of view and say, what is the common ground between these? And I would like you to bear this Brahma Mantra and study a bit more as you go along. Maybe your professors will give you some work to do. But companies that are tolerant, adaptive, coherent, and conservative will last a long time. Have a chance of lasting a long time. No, it's not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed. And the question that arises about Apple and Microsoft and all of these is, yeah, they are damn good. But are they tolerant? Are they adaptive? Are they coherent? Are they conservative? And that is what will determine how long they will be lasting. And whenever they are TACC companies, you tend to love them. Not all of them, but many of them. If I tell you, I'll tell you when the Taj terrorist attack happened in 2008. Of course, all of us were shattered. It's something you don't expect. Uh, and the Taj building, I don't know how many of you are from Bombay. It's a beautiful building at the gateway of India. And to imagine that there was gunfire going on and people were getting shot was a very painful thing for us. But when 3 days were over, we got letters from unknown people who said, I have been a customer, I have come to Taj, I've eaten there, I had my wedding there 40 years ago, etc., etc. And you know what many of them did? They sent a check saying, we love the Taj. That this should have happened in the Taj, humko rone ko aata hai. When I saw some of those letters, I nearly wept. I said, ye imarat hai yaar, building hai, company hai. And people said, I had my wedding there, I had my 25th wedding anniversary there, I celebrated my daughter's wedding there. And they would send a check. Some people send 10,000, 20,000 rupees, some people sent in lakhs. And they wanted to give this money to reconstruct the Taj. Now tell me, if this is not loving a company, what is love? Love is when the other person needs you and you're empathetic and you reach out. And look at the love that Tata gave back. We took that money and said, we don't need the money. We will repair it with our own funds. But we will add to this, and we created a welfare fund for those who suffered under the terrorist attack. And the welfare fund was not for Tata employees, Taj employees. It was for anybody in Bombay. And the first check was given to a person who died in the Oberoi. That is empathy. That is love. And if you keep doing this over 100 years, or 20 years, or 50 years, if you take care of employees who have had an unfortunate mishap, somebody died of COVID, somebody breadwinner died of heart attack, these things unfortunately happen. Companies that take care of their people, their distributors, their associates, those are the companies that are loved. Now, Zomato may do it, but you'll have to wait 50, 60 years to find out. At the moment, you can't tell. And I want you to therefore remember that a company can be respected and loved. And there'll be very, very few such companies. Very few. According to me, in India, I know this because I'm not giving you my personal opinion. When I was still in service in Tata's, we used to do a market research every 6 months. Which are the companies that are respected and loved? I'm not saying this, I didn't influence it. I was just an employee in Tata's. But Tata always came on top. But after Tata came Lever, which of course made me very happy as an ex-employee of Lever's. But Godrej was there. Bajaj was there. But not some of the other well-known companies that you have mentioned. People who gave you free subscription for 6 months. They are not loved. They may be respected. They are not seen as tolerant. So I am making the point to you that it's a subject worth thinking about. And I would like to now just conclude by telling you 2 or 3 stories, because then it will be opening it up to allow you enough time to ask questions. I'm not going through everything that I've written down because I always over prepare, especially when there's a taskmaster like Sanjay Mukherjee around. The first story I've already told you, which is the Taj story, right? The second story I want to tell you is focus on doing what is right, not on hiding what has gone wrong. If you see the public thing, what's happening in the public space, people make mistakes. We are all human beings. I made mistakes in my life. I can tell you about that on a separate occasion. You're going to make mistakes. You already made a few mistakes. But we spend more time hiding our mistakes. And I remember in 2000, I went for a dinner to somebody's house. Mobile phones had just come in at that time. You carried those big fat mobile phones which were heavy and sank your pocket and your trouser down. At 11:30 in the night, the phone rang. And the guy spoke to me. He gave me his name. He said, I don't know you. I don't think I met you. But I want to tell you that one of your companies is doing a fraud and is going to hit the public space very soon. My name is this. I'm ringing you up because I noticed that you're a director of Tata's. And the name of the company is Tata Finance. At 11:30 in the night, what do you do with this information? So I rang up the finance director of the group, apologized for waking him up. He said, no, I've been awake for the last 2 hours, but I've also got such a call. Over the next several weeks, Tata Finance became a big scam. The newspapers wrote about it, the regulators wrote about it. They said, Tata bhi waise hi hai, bigda hua hai. But one of the things that Ratan Tata got up and said, he said, I am the group chairman. I accept the mistake. A mistake has happened, whoever may be at fault. And I want to assure every investor that your money is safe. I will return your money to you. Just give me a little bit of time to find out what the hell went wrong. That calmed down the markets. I asked Mr. Tata, I said, do you know how much? I mean, this can be an obligation which can take you 500 crores or 1,000 crores, or it may finish at 50 crores. And he replied, he said, Gopal, if you made a mistake, you must pay the price for it. You must be prepared to pay the price for it. I don't know what the price is. But I said, if I don't do the right thing at the right time, then what the hell are we doing here? It took us another 4, 5, 6 months. And I was sitting in the boardroom when a proposal came that the total damage is 800 crores. 800 crores, huh? 2,000. I don't know how much money that is in today's terms. And Tata Sons said, we'll pick up the tab. But we won't let investors suffer. Now, according to the Companies Act, any company, your liability is limited to your share capital. We had the option, somebody could run off to London and sit there. There are people who are doing that. They can go to Antigua and they can sit there like Mr. Nirav Modi and Mr. Malia or the other guy, Mehul Choksi. We said, no, we are going to be right here. And if people criticize us, we accept the criticism. But we will make sure they are not financially ruined. We got heart-rending letters from people who said, my pension is inadequate and I put my money into Tata saying, यहाँ से पैसा कभी चोरी नहीं होगा. आपने अपने आंख के सामने चोरी करा दिया. चोरी कराया नहीं, चोरी होने दिया. And we said, no, we will not let you down. And for me, that was a huge lesson in sustainability. And that's what makes the Taj episode, I told you, the Tata episode, makes the Tatas, I suppose, you may not respect Tatas. You may say that their returns are not so good. They are not making aggressive statements every annual general meeting. Mr. Tata doesn't even have a wife to bring to his AGM. Some people are able to bring their wife and family and children to the AGM. He doesn't even have a family to bring. But those are not the criteria of a good company. The criteria of a good company is when the chips are down, in that magical moment, are you able to stand up? That's a sustainable company. I want to give you one example from Hindustan Lever, which is from the area where your institute is. Shillong is probably 120 kilometers from Guwahati, and the whole Assam Valley is there. When I was in the Hindustan Lever Board back 22 years ago, um, or more, 32 years ago, we had a plantation called Dumduma Tea Estate. And with all the problems of alpha, sulfur, and all going on, our plantation manager got a threat that if you don't pay X, we'll bump you off. As you know, many people in the tea gardens, to buy peace and to buy their peace and to buy their life, they paid. But Tata Lever said we will not pay. But the threat continued. And we said, if anything happens to our manager or any of our staff there, then that blood will be on our hands. What do we do? And to cut a long story short, we said we owe it to our people first. You can have your principle, but other people cannot die for it. We went and contacted right from the Intelligence Bureau. We contacted the Prime Minister's office, the Chief of the Army Staff, the Indian Air Force. Mind you, we did all this through a plan. It didn't happen by just ringing up people. We landed a plane in Dumduma, which is beyond Tinsukia, got all our people into the plane and flew them out without anybody knowing about it. It is the single airlift in India's aviation history where nobody knew that a plane with 80 or 100 people, mothers, children, all, we flew them out. And of course, the next day, when they found out that everybody ghar khali karke chala gaya, we did the opposite of what Vijay Mallya did. We didn't run away. We lifted our people to safety, and then we said, now we are closing down the plantation. In due course, things got sorted out. So I don't want to go on and on. I'm going to stop there and ask if how you want to do the Q&A. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer it. Sanjoy or Mr. Kakoti. If you all want to direct the questions, or I'm very happy to answer because you got 5 minutes more, 10 minutes more.
Actually, it was such a fascinating experience listening to you. I thought it would be a shame to interrupt and cut the flow of thought that was coming so very well.
Not
But
just flow
anyway,
of thought, but a flow of life.
yes. So I think we open it up for a few questions. And
two participants have raised hand.
Trio, you go first, please.
Hello, Professor Gopalakrishnan. I just wanted to, it was an amazing talk. I loved it. I was just thinking about the personification of a company and the idea of loving a company. You had mentioned that, a lot of young companies can be respected, but love comes with a bit more legacy, a bit more age. And I was just thinking, would it not be more precise to say love is something that comes through experience? Like I'm 26 years old, and I personally love a brand like Titan, but that's because of my experiences with Titan, my stories attached with Titan. And that is possible with an older company, but that is also possible with a younger company. So that is the first question. And another part of it is, what am I supposed to do with that love? If I love and respect a company, is there anything other than taking a definitive action, like you had mentioned, sending checks when the Taj incident happened, something like that? Or is there something more at a basic level that I can do when I love and respect a company?
See, the first thing, Atreo, I did not intend to suggest that love comes only for older companies. You are very right in saying, like Infosys is a young company. When I began my career, there was nothing called Infosys. There was nothing called TCS. Right? I began my career 55 years ago. So, but it's not 155 years ago. I'm not a contemporary of Shah Jahan or Akbar or something like that. So in the last 55 years, company HDFC didn't exist. when I started my career. So they're all young companies. It depends on what is your definition of young. Yes, if it is 4 years old, it's a different matter. But these are all companies that are 30, 40 years old. Marico, I've done books on these, but so I know each of them extremely well. So um, at a guy at my age, I will say a company which is 40, 50 years old is young. हमसे तो छोटा है ना. So it is possible to love a company which is younger than me, 30, 40 years, but it may be a bit difficult. It will be more infatuation if you love a company which is 5 years old. If it's your own company, of course, that's a different matter. I'm not talking of that. But it's like the popular perception of love is that you love when you're 26. But I would say you love better when you're 76.
That is something beyond my experience.
It is beyond your experience. But love does grow with time, right? There's nothing wrong with it. And many of us go through the rigors of life, and then we say, this man or this woman has stood by me, and we have done all this together, and we produced this lovely family. And that's a different kind of love from the puppy love, which I've also been a puppy, so I've also had puppy love. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm talking of the deep love. Now, what can you do with it? This world moves because people love each other and love society, right? And that is true Atmanirbhar. Not all this poppycock that comes out of politicians. Real love. And if you read poetry, if you're a Bengali, think of what Rabindranath said. Rabindranath may not be fashionable for young Bengalis, but he was a very deep guy. Janar madhe ojaner korechi shondan, Janar madhe ojaner korechi shondan.
Ojanare.
Ojanare.
Janar maje ojanare korechi shondan.
He wrote a book. He wrote a poem called Akash Shurjo. What?
Akash bhora shurjo tara.
Akash bhora shurjo. And it's a beautiful poem. It's what the poem of people of your age should be. So English translation the other way.
I'll try. I'll definitely try. Sure.
It's a beautiful poem. He says the life is full of love, and the sky is full of sun and stars. And that's all that love should give you. Don't look for a return on capital employed. Theek ache?
That was the dearest song of my father, who's no more.
Okay.
Thank you.
We probably have time for one more. So I don't know. There's so many hands up. So I think we should give a chance to a lady. Pearl, can you go next? If it's short, maybe we might have time for another one.
Yeah, quick questions.
Hello, Professor. So my question is, it's on the parallel to the second incident that you told us about of the airlifting of the employees. So when an organization has been set up and then such kind of problem because of external factors arises, how this decision to take place, how the priorities are set, because as young managers that we will be getting into, so how these priorities are actually set, is it in terms of the financial decisions or the humanity decisions, what all thought process we have to go through? So this is my question.
Pearl, it has nothing to do, sorry, I shouldn't say nothing to do. In trying to answer you very briefly, I might appear to be cut and dried. It is to do with who you are. If I have borrowed from you 10,000 rupees, and you're my friend, I don't sign a piece of paper, I promise to return 10,000. If Sanjay takes 10,000 from me, I say, Sanjay, I know him, paisa wapas dega. So the world moves on trust and love and respect for each other. And whether you respect and trust the people who work for you. In this country, I don't know how many thousand people have died of COVID. There's not one guy who's got up and said, I'm terribly sorry to hear all this happening. Not one guy, except an RJD MP, whose name is Jha, I think, Manoj Kumar Jha, who's written such a spirited thing. He's saying this is not BJP or Congress. It is to do with what have we collectively done to the people of this country. And I would like us as legislators, he didn't say the Prime Minister or the opposition, to apologize to this country that you let you down. Like Ratan Tata got up and apologized for Tata Finance, although he wasn't personally involved with it. That is leadership. That is who you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. We just have 3 more minutes, and the other speaker is probably there. Sir, what we did for the conference, every speaker, as a token of respect for the person, we have planted a sapling. We have called it a sapling of hope in celebration of life. And you, sir, epitomize it. So thank you very much for spending your evening with us.
Thank you.
All the best to all of you and your
life.
students, and good luck to you. Take care.
Thank you very much. We look forward to your continued guidance and help in shaping of our students. Thank you very much, sir. Any last word, Professor Sanjay?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Namaskar. Bhalo thakben.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Mary, have you joined in?
Dr. Mary Gentile.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, lovely.
Yes.
Lovely to hear your voice.
Good to see you all.
Yes, it's been quite a few years. You were here for the first of the Suscons.
In person.
I remember driving you to show you our new campus. Our proposed campus. We have shifted there. And this time you must come and see the new campus in operation.
I would love to come back to India. It's been too long.
Right. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to host you this evening on the 8th Sustainability Conference. This time what we have done is we have dovetailed it with the week-long Sustainability Foundation course, which is a compulsory course for all the new entrants to the college, the MBA and the PhDs. So we are 251 strong, and we represent 24 states of the country. So we have a mini India amongst the group that is here. And this is also part of the conference. I would like to request my friend and colleague, Professor Sanjay, to give a brief introduction of the speaker. Sir, over to you.
So I would start my introduction by saying it's a Beatles song. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Dr. Mary Gentile, my revered and beloved Mary, Mother Mary, had a tremendous amount of a profound influence on my life and thoughts for the last 20 years. This is how I will start my introduction. Dr. Mary C. Gentile is the creator, director of Giving Voice to Values, GVV, professor of practice at University of Virginia, Darden School of Business, senior advisor at Aspen Institute, Business and Society Program, and consultant on management education and leadership development. Among numerous other awards, Mary Gentile was named as one of the top minds 2017 by the Ethisphere and one of the top thought leaders in Trust 2015 Lifetime Achievement Award winners by Trust across America, Trust around the world. January 2015. She was recently shortlisted for the Thinkers 50 2019 award for Ideas and Practice, having also Ideas into Practice, having also been shortlisted in 2017. Giving Voice to Values, her creation, her baby, also won the bronze medal in the 2017 Reimagine Education Ethical Leadership Awards. Friends, a former professor of Harvard University, Harvard Business School, Business Ethics, Dr. Mary Gentile had been a fountain of inspiration to many, many people like me across the world. Mother Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Professor Kakoti and Sanjay. It's wonderful to to be back speaking to you and to your students and colleagues. I wish I was in Shillong again. And I'm honored and happy to have a chance to share a bit about giving voice to values, or GVV, as you mentioned, with the group today. Thank you so much for the time. So, you know, as Sanjay already indicated, I'm a professor at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business, and I spent my entire career working in business education, 10 years at Harvard Business School, 5 years at Babson College, which is #1 in the world for entrepreneurship, and now at Darden at University of Virginia. I created Giving Voice to Values about a dozen years ago now. It's a new approach, an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. I created it because I was frustrated with the way we talked about ethics and values in business, whether it was in business schools or whether it was in practice. And I'm going to share with you the story today about why and how I created it, the research it's based on, why and how it works. But I'll just tell you at the start that although when we created it, the hope was to influence management education, and it has. It's now been piloted and or shared at well over 1,300 educational institutions and organizations on all 7 continents, even the Antarctic. It's grown well beyond business schools. We've now are also working with law schools, with schools of engineering, healthcare, medicine, and nursing, and we work with many companies, large and small. And so when we get to the questions, I'd be happy to share some stories, if you like, about how this has been used in various corporate settings, which I assume is part of the interest of you all today. But let me take a step backward first and just talk to you a little bit about what Giving Voice to Values is and why I created it the way I did. I'm just going to give you the headline right up front, because I know you've been sitting on Zoom for a while, and sometimes that can be a little numbing. So in case you daze out at any point, let me just tell you what the bottom line is right now. Giving voice to values. If you don't remember anything else from what I say today, I hope you'll remember this, that giving voice to values is about asking and answering a new question, a different question when it comes to values and ethics in our business lives and in our fuller lives as well. So the typical question that we tend to ask and try to answer is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a good question. It's an important question. It's one that you probably have been discussing in this conference and in other settings in your educational and life experience. But giving voice to values is about asking and answering a different question. It's about asking and answering the question, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how can you get it done effectively? What do you need to say and do? And what will the pushback be? What will be the objections that you encounter? And then what would you say and do? And who do you speak to and in what sequence? And are you going to do this alone? Or do you need to build a coalition, a set of allies? And do you need to reframe the whole challenge? And is this a one-off situation where you just need to deal with one question? Or is this actually a systemic challenge? And if it's a systemic challenge, then it needs to be addressed in a systemic or more holistic way. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for individuals, because it's only individuals who can plan that more incremental and step-by-step systemic approach. In fact, India was one of the first international settings where I brought giving voice to values. And a number of years ago, we had funding from the United Nations Global Compact Prime to develop a series of GVV cases that were based on fighting corruption, anti-corruption. And we worked with a group of Indian faculty and Indian managers to develop a series of, I forget, 8 to 10 cases. And I was so impressed with the persistent, the resilient, the creative and innovative and committed approaches that these managers took in trying to address these issues. Giving voice to values is not about the intellectual discussion about what's right. It's really about how do you act. So taking a step backward, let me just tell you where it came from. And I like to tell people that giving voice to values grew out of something quite personal. It grew out of my own crisis of faith. I had been working in business education for several decades at leading institutions like Harvard. And I'd been working on these issues around how do you teach and train and consult about values and ethics in business. And I became quite disillusioned. It seemed to me that at best, this work was futile, and at worst, it was hypocritical. And I had those reactions for a number of reasons. First of all, it seemed that every few years there would be a spate of scandals that would hit the business press. Back in the 70s, we had defense industry scandals. In the 80s, there were the insider trading scandals. In the 90s, we had all the challenges around the dot-com bubble. And then with the turn of the century, we had Enron and WorldCom and Parmalat and Galleon Group. And then more recently, we've had Volkswagen and Wells Fargo and Theranos and et cetera. And it's, if you happen to be working in a business school, especially a leading business school, when these kinds of scandals would hit the press, there would be a lot of consternation, as I'm sure you can imagine. There would be articles in the business press about, what the heck are they teaching in business schools? Because it was often graduates from these leading institutions who were the architects of these various scandals. And so if you happen to be working in these institutions, we would tend to create a task force or a committee to try and look at what is it that we're doing and why is this the outcome? And so I was on this kind of a committee various times throughout my career, because that was the area I was working in. And we would interview students, and we'd interview alumni and recruiters, and we would talk to all the faculty, and we would review the curriculum and try and figure out what is it that we're teaching and how can we improve it. And we would end up, creating a new course or hiring some new faculty or creating some new research institute. And we would send out the press releases. And then a few years later, the whole cycle would start again. And so that was discouraging and disillusioning. So that was the first reason for my crisis of faith. The second reason for my crisis of faith was a little more personal. Around the turn of the last century, the late 90s, early 2000, I got invited to be on a panel and a debate. A friend of mine, Kirk Hansen, who used to run the ethics program for Stanford Business School, had retired from Stanford, and he went to run the Markkula Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University in California in the US. And he decided he was going to host a debate. And he was going to have two people on one side of the debate who were arguing that after 25 years, a quarter of a century of good faith effort to try and address ethics and values in business education, we've made a huge amount of progress. And then he was going to have two people on the other side of the debate saying we hadn't made any progress. And on that negative side of the debate, he had Milton Friedman's son. So you might imagine what he might be saying. And he asked me to be on the side of the debate that was saying we had made all this progress because I'd been working in this field. So I sat down to write my remarks for this panel, for this debate. And I had this moment, it was kind of a watershed moment where I thought, can I lie on an ethics panel? Because if I really was to think about it, honestly, I wasn't sure I really could say we had made all that much progress. So I ended up writing something sort of nuanced, where I said, well, any of us who are educators or managers or even mentors know that there are individuals that we've had an impact on. But if I were going to speak more generally, I really couldn't say that we'd made all that much progress. That wasn't exactly what my friend Kirk had hoped I would say, but it was really the best I could do. And that was sort of a moment for me, because I thought, really, after all this effort and all this work, is that really the best I can say? And then I guess the last reason, and perhaps the biggest reason for my crisis of faith, was what I actually saw in groups like this, in classrooms or in corporate training settings when we were trying to talk about ethics and values. And it was this, that whenever we were going to talk about ethics, we would typically share some sort of case study, some sort of scenario, and people would read the case and they would walk into the discussion with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. And then in the course of the conversation, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that their thinking would become more complex. They would begin to realize, maybe I didn't have all the information, or maybe this is actually kind of standard operating procedure in this part of the world, or in this industry, or in this company. Or maybe it is wrong, but it's really not my responsibility. It's above my pay grade, Or maybe it is wrong, but if I try and do something about it, I'm not likely to have an impact. I may even make it worse. So, there would be this process of thinking that would complicate their thinking. I actually think that's a good thing. You don't want people to walk into these challenges naively. You want them to have thought in a complex and serious way. But the second thing that would happen in these conversations was more troubling to me. I don't know if you have this experience in your classrooms or in companies you've worked with, but I would typically find that when I was in a group like this, there were usually 1 or 2 or 3 people that when they spoke, everybody would turn to listen to them. Maybe they were the most articulate, maybe they were the most assertive, maybe they were the ones who always had a humorous story to tell to illustrate their point. But whatever it was, and when I'm in a corporate setting, they were usually the people of the highest rank in the room. But whatever it was, when those people spoke, the ones that everyone listened to, they were usually expressing the most skeptical, if not cynical, kinds of positions. They were usually the ones who were saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world, it's just not possible. So people were listening, they were listening to the people who were telling them you couldn't do this. So it seemed to me that students or managers were walking out of these conversations both more confused and less empowered. And I thought, really? Is that the best we can do? Is that how I want to spend my life? I became discouraged, and I felt like, life is short. I want to do something that matters. And I've got some other skills, I'll go do something else. And so for all those reasons, I decided I'm going to take a step back from this work. I'm going to find something else I can do that will be meaningful. And so this was around the late 90s. And around that time, a number of things happened that led to me to the creation of Giving Voice to Values. I'm only going to tell you a couple things, a couple stories. But the first story I'm going to tell you is, I decided I was going to try and do some other things. And I got a consulting job around that time for Columbia Business School in New York. And I was there working on a project. And while I was there, there were a group of faculty who had decided that they were going to try and do something about ethics in their MBA program. And they knew about the work I had done previously at Harvard. And so they asked me if I would take a look at what they were doing and give them some thoughts. So I did. So this is what they were doing. This was their idea, not mine. They were inviting all of the incoming MBA students at Columbia. At the time, that was about 600 or so in a cohort. Upon matriculation, during orientation, they were inviting them to answer one question and then just to jot it down, just a paragraph or two. And this was the question. Tell us about a time in your work experience so far when you were explicitly told or implicitly pressured to do something that conflicted with your own values, and how you and tell us how you handled it. And so they all wrote these little stories, right? And they gathered them and they came to me and they said, would you read these stories and let us know what you think? So I read hundreds of these stories, well over 1,000 over several years, and they were really interesting. So let me tell you some of the things we learned. So the first thing we learned is if you look at the kinds of students who were getting an MBA at Columbia, at least at that time, they tended to already have several years of work experience already. So the first thing that you learned is that I could probably count on one hand the number of them who said, I was never asked to do something that conflicted with my own values. They pretty much all had a story to tell. And then the second thing we learned is, again, if you look at the kinds of students who get MBAs at Columbia, it's in New York City. Certain industries are more heavily represented than others. So there's, a lot of people from the financial world because of all the concentration of financial businesses in New York. There were a lot of people from big pharma because a lot of the major multinational pharmaceutical firms have headquarters in the tri-state area. There were a good number of people from the big consulting firms, the McKinseys of the world. A good number of people from high tech, So because certain industries were more heavily represented, the kinds of stories they told got repetitious really quickly. So they talked about things like, I was pressured to inflate or deflate my billable hours in a way that didn't really correspond with the work that I did. Or I was asked to tamper with or adjust the equations or the benchmarks that I used to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage my clients to take the action that would maximize revenue for my firm, for my employer. Or I was encouraged to exaggerate the capabilities of a new product, a piece of software or a pharmaceutical product, in order to encourage or to increase sales revenues, even if our research really didn't justify some of the claims I was making. And then there were often stories about corruption, various forms of bribes or facilitating payments in order to gain access to certain markets or to compete in certain RFPs. And then there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues, issues around hiring and firing, fairness, discrimination. So the stories got repetitious really quickly. What was interesting is that their responses, their reactions differed. And their reactions fell into several recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little less than half of them said, yes, I had this kind of values conflict and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back, but I really didn't think I had any options. And so I just sucked it up and did what they told me to do. That was a little less than half of them. And then there was a small group who said, yes, I had this conflict. It bothered me so much, I couldn't bring myself to do it. But I also couldn't think of anything else that I could do. So these people removed themselves from the situation. So they got themselves transferred to a different work group or a different manager, and a few of them even quit their jobs. But that was a small group. Now the remainder of the whole group, so now we're talking about a third of them, said, yes, I had this conflict and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of them said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So I thought, what is it? Why are these people able to do this effectively when so many others don't? And we thought, well, maybe there'd be something we could learn from this. Maybe there'd be some lesson we could pull from this that would help us to develop a better way of training people and preparing people for the kinds of value savvy. Because some of these folks who acted on their values did, in fact, come up with these really ingenious win-wins. But some of them were kind of naive and even clumsy in the way they did it. So that wasn't really the distinction. So in the end, the only thing we could say is that the people who'd been able to do this effectively at some point said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started by talking to a friend or a spouse or a partner, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. So when I heard that, I got discouraged again. I kind of went back to my crisis of faith. And I thought, well, what do I do with that? I was sort of hoping for some sort of insight that would help us really better prepare people to do this successfully. And I really wasn't sure what to do with this. But then I remembered something. I remembered some research that I had seen years earlier when I was still at Harvard. And it was research by two different scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London. And they both decided independently that they wanted to do research on what they were calling moral conviction. All right. So what they were trying to do was to look at people who had acted on their values at times where there were really high stakes, high risk. And they wanted to do qualitative research to interview these people in depth and find out, did they have something in common that enabled them to do this? Were they different than other people? And so they both independently decided that the populations of people they would interview are folks who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their own lives at stake during World War II, during the Holocaust, to help those who were endangered, whose lives were endangered, when many, many people did not. And they did these in-depth interviews with these people, and they found a set of characteristics. They wanted to see, did they have any common family background, religious background, early life experience, educational experience. Why were these people able and willing to act when so many others did not? And they found a set of characteristics, most of which I frankly don't remember, but there was one that really stuck with me because I was an educator. And they said that these people who acted with this kind of conviction in these high risk situations all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult like you all, they had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss, a teacher, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience with this person where this person would ask them, what would you do if, and then various kinds of moral conflicts. And they would have the opportunity to literally rehearse how they would respond to these situations. And they had this experience at both the cognitive level, but also at the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they were actually naming the value or values that mattered to them, and they were putting words to it, a kind of script and articulation. But at the behavioral level, they were having the experience of literally voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to speak with in the actual circumstances. So it was this idea of prescripting and rehearsal and practice and peer coaching. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Let's do some other kinds of exploration. So we did two kinds of exploration. First, we gathered stories. We already had all those hundreds of stories from the Columbia students, but I started interviewing people at every level in companies, from people right out of business school all the way up to C-suite executives, and asking them that same question. Tell me about a time when your own values conflicted with something you felt pressured to do, and how you handled it. And I gathered stories about times when they'd been successful and also times when they had been unsuccessful. And then we also explored the other kind of exploration we did as we looked at the research. This was about 10, 12 years ago. There was starting to be a lot of research, there's more now, that suggested that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and prescripting and peer coaching are very effective methods. So in the field of psychology, you may have seen some of the research on habit formation. Charles Duhigg has written a book on the power of habit, and they talk about the strategies you can use to create a habit of a certain kind of behavior. There's also a group in the field of psychology who study what's called positive deviance. These are people who study folks who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they have a really nice phrase. This is their phrase, not mine, but I'll share it with you because I think it helps capture some of what I'm saying. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then there was, I started to see research. I'm sure you've seen some of the popularizations of research in the field of cognitive neurosciences. And there was research on brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways, which all reinforce this idea of rehearsal and practice. But the research I want to share with you, because it's more tangible and I think it'll be more memorable to you, comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. So let me just tell you a story. Back when I was first working at Harvard Business School, I decided that I needed to take a self-defense class. Now, I'd been lucky. I had never felt the need to take a self-defense class before that. But once I went to Harvard Business School, I thought maybe it would be useful. I don't know if they're connected. But I went and I looked around Boston, and there were a lot of these courses. Maybe some of you have taken such a course, and they all teach pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves. So it's fist to bridge of nose, or heel to instep, or knee to groin, and they have you practice these moves in the air. And the idea is now, if anyone ever attacks me, I know what to do, right? But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging, and it was a developmental model. So they would still teach you all those moves, and you'd rehearse them in the air. But then at a certain point, once you knew the moves, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, if you remember that. And we would all line up, and we would take turns being attacked full force by this gentleman. And you could use the moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But then as the class went on, week after week, I might be talking to you, he would come and grab me. I would never know when, I would never know what hold he was going to use. It was utterly nerve-wracking. But they explained to us that the idea behind this was something called specific state muscle memory. Those of you in this room who are athletes will probably know about this. The idea is if you rehearse something in the same physiological and cognitive and emotional state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in that moment, your body will remember. So this is why the tennis pro will practice her serve over and over before she goes to the tournament. And then when she's there under all that stress, her body will just naturally assume the proper form. So one day I'm in this class, right? And I'm lying on my back on the floor because I have failed to protect myself when the guy attacked me. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a default behavior, a habit, a default to voice, but not just to speaking up? Because one of the things I was learning from all those people I was interviewing is that the people who do this effectively, it's not a matter often of, going to your boss and telling him or her that they're all wrong or that they're evil. And it's not always a matter of blowing a whistle, because that can be that cannot always be that useful as well. It's usually much more strategic, much more tactical, much more nuanced. And so I thought, well, could you create a default to informed voice? Because the other thing I was hearing is that the arguments, the reasons, we call them reasons and rationalizations, that people hear for why you can't act on your values are powerful, but they're not bulletproof, and they're pretty repetitious. There's certain things you hear all the time. And the point is, it's very challenging to try and think of an effective response in the moment. But if you've actually thought about them in advance, and you've actually thought about how these rationalizations can be reframed, you can be more skillful and you can be more nuanced and creative in the way you respond to them, also more persuasive. So for example, we've identified some of the most frequently heard objections that you tend to hear, and then we've started to unpack ways to respond to them. So you'll hear things like, well, it's not a big enough deal to deal with, it's not material. Or you'll hear, this is just standard operating procedure, this is just the way we do it in this company or this industry or this part of the world. Or you'll hear, well, it may be problematic, but it's not your responsibility. It's above your responsibility. Or we might hear, yes, maybe it's wrong, but I want you to be loyal to your company or your manager or your colleague or your customer. So you hear those kinds of arguments over and over. They're powerful, but as I said, they're not bulletproof. And so what we started to see is we need to create some kind of training, some kind of teaching technology that will enable people to prepare better and become more skillful and comfortable and more have a habit of raising these issues and raising them not in an emotional way, because you've practiced it. So you can do it calmly. You don't have to accuse someone of being evil, which is not necessarily going to be very effective in trying to persuade them. And so we thought, well, we need to create this kind of teaching technology. So I'm sure you all have experienced case studies, typical case studies. When I was at Harvard Business School, one of my jobs was to hire and train and manage their entire 60-person case writing program. And I wrote many best-selling cases when I was there. So I'm very familiar with that form, as I'm sure you are as well. And you know what they're like. They're 10 or 15 pages long, and they tend to feature the CEO. And at the end of the case, the CEO usually leans back in their chair and looks out the window and says, what should I do? And then students or managers will discuss for 45 minutes or an hour, what is the right thing to do? I think cases can be very effective because they're based on real situations, but they don't teach you how to act. They teach you how to decide. And so I thought we really need to have a different kind of teaching technology. So we created what we call the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. So instead of our case, there's still scenarios, there's still cases, but our cases tend to be short, much shorter than the traditional Harvard case. They often are a page, a couple pages. And they also feature people at every level in the organization, not just the CEO, because one of the things we learned from Columbia students is that you start having these challenges right away. It's not like you wait till you're the CEO to have an ethical conflict. But the big difference between a GVV style case and a traditional case is they're what we call post-decision making. So they don't ask you at the end, so what's the right thing to do? They end with a protagonist who already has decided what he or she thinks the right thing to do is. And the question is, how could they get it done successfully? What would they need to say and do? What would the objections they face be like? And how would they need to build a response to that? And how could they build a set of allies if they need that? And how do they need to reframe the challenge? And what data do they need to bring to this? So people literally have the opportunity to pre-script and rehearse and peer coach effective strategies. And we call them thought experiments because we never ask people, what would you do? We don't do that because we know from the most recent research in behavioral ethics is that when people face values conflicts, they don't tend to sit down and write a pro and con list or think about what would Aristotle say, or think about, let me look at it from a utilitarian perspective or from a deontological perspective. What we tend to do is we react emotionally in the moment based on what we feel is possible. And then we rationalize after the fact why this was the right thing to do or why it was the only thing to do. We don't do this consciously. It's kind of an automatic emotional response because people don't want to live in a space of cognitive dissonance where they know something's wrong and they do it anyways. And so instead, we react emotionally and then we find a way to justify it. This is all kind of automatic. So if I simply teach you models of ethical reasoning, whether they come from Indian traditions or Western traditions or from Confucian traditions, if I teach you those things, that's still an intellectual debate, but it doesn't necessarily rewire that automatic connection that we have. And so instead, I do want to rewire that connection. So we use this thought experiment where we simply say, here's someone who's already decided what they think is right. How could they get it done? What if you were this person and you wanted to do this? That's the thought experiment. So it doesn't trigger that defensive emotional response where you try and justify what you think is possible. Instead, it brings out the creativity and the innovation. It creates this kind of laboratory, a safe space to think about how could I do this? Because we know also from the research that people are more creative when they feel less pressured, less stressed, when they have that safe space to be innovative. And so that's how we framed our scenarios. So we created hundreds of these pieces of material, exercises, GVV case studies, readings, books, there's MOOCs, there's online modules. We created all these materials and we made them available, many of them for free. And we invited people to experiment with them. And the response has been kind of remarkable to us. This, as I say, I started this about 10 years ago, and it just sort of grew exponentially. People started to see that it could be a really interesting way to build this sort of moral muscle. And so it is being used in many, many educational settings. But what's surprising to me is that companies started coming to us. We never marketed it, but companies started coming to us. The first company was Lockheed Martin, the defense contractor. They've been now using this approach for about, 8 or 10 years. We've worked with Unilever in Nigeria. We've worked with Prudential. We've worked with the Chartered Financial Analysts Institute all over the world. We're working with KPMG right now, designing training for their 33,000 employees. We're working with some pharmaceutical firms, both in the US and in Europe. And so the idea here is that companies see that this is a powerful approach too, because they also tended to approach ethics as if it was just a matter of intellect. It was just a matter of giving you a set of rules and then inviting you to act and telling you needed to act on them. And so they'd give you scenarios so you could decide, is this over the line or not? But they didn't actually then tell you, once you decided something was over the line, how to act on it. And so the companies we've worked with have felt this is really useful because it actually builds that muscle, that moral muscle memory. And some companies like McKinsey have decided that this is useful not just for ethics, but for bringing values to leadership training, because leadership is often about communicating about things that are not always easy to talk about. And so having this rehearsal, this practice can be very effective. Since we made all these materials available, people have started to do more research on the impact of using GVV. I mean, originally Giving Voice to Values was based on empirical research that suggested that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and practice were effective strategies, but it wasn't research on GVV. But now, since GVV has been out there for a while, there are some faculty who are actually doing some research on the impact of this approach, most notably in the field of accounting. There's a number of faculty in accounting in the US who have done pre and post studies and have been able to show significant findings that this impacts students' behavior. I'll tell you one anecdote. There's a group of faculty in the US, accounting faculty in Washington State, in the northwest part of the United States. And in the US, in order to become a certified public accountant, in order to get licensed, you have to take a certain amount of ethics, accounting ethics education. And so these accounting faculty very conscientiously built ethics into their accounting education. This was for undergraduate accounting students. And so students would declare their major in their sophomore year, their second year, and they would have 3 years of accounting education and accounting ethics. And when they got to be seniors in their fourth year in college, these two faculty gave their students an assignment. And they said, we want you to do this problem set, and we want you to post your answers to this website. And then once you've posted them, we want you to go to a different website and get some more information that's relevant. But we don't want you to look at the second website until you've already submitted your first answer, because it would give some things away, right? So sort of students were on their honor. And so they'd gone through 3 years of teaching them accounting ethics, and they gave them this assignment. And they could tell if people went to the websites, and almost all the students went to the second website before they handed in their assignment. And these faculty were, they were so disappointed because they'd been spending all this time focusing on ethics, and obviously the students were not connecting with it. And that was around the time that I met them. And so I shared with them GVV, and they thought, well, this is interesting, we'll try this. So they started to build with the next group of students, they started to build GVV into their accounting ethics education over sophomore, junior, senior year. And by the time they got to senior year with that cohort, they gave them the same assignment, and none of them went to the other website before they turned in their assignment. Now, you can't say that that's definitive empirical research, right? It's correlative, it's not necessarily causal, but it's pretty provocative. And they were quite pleased about this, and they've continued to build on this. Other accounting faculty have been doing more traditional research. That was sort of a natural experiment, but there's other faculty who are now doing more traditional research on that. And companies are telling me that when they introduce GVV, they find that employees are in fact bringing issues. That Lockheed Martin has told me that more employees will bring issues to their ethics and compliance officers, but not to just blow the whistle or report it. They'll say, there's something going on. I think it could be problematic. I want to deal with it, but can I work with you to create an effective approach, a script, an action plan? And so the ethics and compliance officers find this very encouraging, because they're finding out about issues before they become mandatorily reported. But they're also feeling like employees are taking some ownership for trying to change the conversation in their own work groups. This is more true culture change, right? So we're starting to see those kinds of impacts, which is really encouraging. I think I'm running close to the end of my time, so I want to wrap up, but I want to just say that you've probably figured out by now that giving voice to values is really just kind of a reframe, right? Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? And I often tell people that giving voice to values is based on three reframes, the three GVV reversals, or the three GVV flips. So we have flipped, we have reversed what it is you're talking about when you talk about ethics and values in your organizations. We've reversed who you think you're talking to, and we've reversed how you're having that conversation. So in terms of what it is you're talking about, it used to be, I remember actually when I was still at Harvard, we used to talk about, let's not write a case about an obvious situation, sort of clear cut, right, wrong, black and white. Let's write cases about the more complex gray issues where it's not quite clear what's right. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. We're educating people. We want them to think more seriously. But I've actually changed my mind about that. I still think it's good to talk about the gray issues. There are a lot of them. But, I think intelligent people of goodwill and responsibility can legitimately disagree. That's why those issues are gray. But nevertheless, there are a lot of issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree, oh, that's clearly over the line. That's clearly illegal. It's clearly fraudulent. It's clearly abusive. But just because most of us may agree that it's over the line doesn't mean that we feel equipped to act on it effectively. And so I've decided, let's focus our giving voice to values rehearsal and prescripting and practice on those clear-cut issues, the issues where most of us already agree. Because if I focus on the gray issues, you never get past the debate about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. You never get past the debate about what really is right. But if you can focus on issues where most of us actually think, that's corrupt or that's illegal or whatever it is, then you can get to implementation. And so that's the first change. We try to focus on issues where most of us would agree this is not right. And then, of course, the case is framed as what if. It's the thought experiment. What if you thought this was the right or wrong thing to do? How could you get it done? So in that way, we enable people to get past that endless debate. And what we found, ironically, I remember working with the US Army and someone was pointing this out to me, that what we found ironically is that if you start to feel more empowered, if you start to feel more skillful, if you start to feel more able to act on your values, there'll be fewer gray issues, because a lot of times we tell ourselves it's gray. It's part of that rationalizing process because we want to not feel so bad that we didn't act. And so that's why we've flipped what it is we're talking about to those more agreed upon issues. The second flip is who we think we're talking to. Often when I'll go into a school or I'll go into a company and, people will say, most of the people here are good people. We've just got a few bad apples. And those are the ones that the training is for, right? But I think of the audience differently. I think of the audience as a bell curve. This is the people in the classroom or the people in the company. And this is based on some research by a friend of mine, the late Greg Bees and Peter Crampton, who did research on ethics and negotiations. But we think about the organization as a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. And we would define opportunists as people who would say, I'll do whatever it takes to maximize my material self-interest, regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who would say, that's my primary motivation. And at the other tail end of the bell curve, we premise are the folks who would self-identify as idealists. These are the people who would say, I will always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. Now, what we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put myself there. And we call them pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll succeed. So there's still some uncertainty, but it means I think I have a shot. I think, I might be able to do this. So if you think of your audience that way, I don't really think I have the power to change the opportunists. I think they're always going to be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I would like them to be more skillful. I'd like them to be more effective. But what we really are focusing on are the pragmatists, and we want to give them the literal scripts, the skills, the rehearsal, the practice, the positive examples to be who they already want to be at their best. We're not trying to change them. We're trying to enable them to be who they already want to be at their best. Now, if you think of your audience that way, if we can empower and enable and skill up the pragmatists and the idealists to be more skillful at this, more effective at this, more comfortable and confident at this, our premise is that that changes the water that the opportunists are swimming in, so that the calculus that they do to determine what's in their self-interest has to change, because they can't rely on the same level of silent complicity from everybody else. And so that's how we've reframed who it is we're talking to. And then the final flip is, how we do this, and I've already explained to you. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? And that's GVV in a nutshell. So I'm gonna stop there. I think we've got a few minutes for some questions or comments, and I'd be happy to receive them. But I really appreciate you letting me share Giving Voice to Values with you today. It's always an honor, and I feel especially happy when I get to share it with folks in India, because India was one of the first places where I had a really effective and positive response to this approach. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. That was extremely enriching, and we have certainly benefited from this. I just have two comments to make before I open it up for questions. And the comment number one is when you talked about brain plasticity, and that is something that we have been experimenting here at IIM Shillong too, saying that how can we reinforce a particular behavior? And once that's reinforced, it becomes a part of your natural behavior. And that's exactly what the GVV is also doing. That's number one. And number two is you're talking about reinforcement of the moral compass. And once you have that compass in place, no matter what, it's always going to point north. But one struggle that me and Sanjoy, we often face in class is that actually, once you have the compass in place, it doesn't matter what subject you're talking about, what decision you're taking. It's always pointing north. So you know what's the right decision to take. Now, when subjects like sustainability or ethics or values, they get reduced to a subject, it's actually all encompassing. You can't remove it from finance, you can't remove it from marketing, you can't remove it from whatever, because values are values and they go everywhere. I think that's one of the biggest struggles that as an educator I face, and the moment of despair that you face is a moment of despair I face now. It was fascinating. So that is a challenge that we might address in our conversations later over mails, because I wouldn't want to start that now. So we have got three.
Can I say one thing? Can
Yes.
I say one thing, Sanjeev?
Yes, please.
We can talk about it later if you like, but what you just described is really the motivation I had for creating Giving Voice to Values, because I was working at Harvard, not with the ethics faculty, but with the faculty in finance or marketing or operations or HR. And I was trying to come up with a pedagogy that would enable them to feel like they could talk about these issues without having to be philosophers. And that they could, when you frame something as a thought experiment, okay, this is a marketing question, how could I get, the ethical thing done, however we've defined it in the case. We were asking them to use the language, the vocabulary, the analytics, the frameworks of the discipline you're teaching. Because if you are working, you're not going to go to your boss and quote Aristotle or John Rawls. You're going to go to your boss and use arguments that are framed in the language of your function, whether it's auditing or marketing or operations. And so we really designed it in that way. And the good news is that there are faculty in finance and in operations and in other areas who are using this approach. So accounting, as I said, is one of the biggest. So we can talk about it later, but I just wanted to mention, yes, I share your thought on that.
Right. But I mean, you provoked me for another word here. The thing is, the moment we talk about brain plasticity, on the other side is brain rigidity. And we have looked at almost everything in life with very, very rigid kind of overviews. So I think that this is my domain and that is yours. And actually, knowledge does not have domain. So the other thing that we would need to do is probably transcend the domain limitations of thinking and have that overarching idea that this is the way we're going to do it. But I will not come in
Exactly.
anymore. Yes.
But we can have another conversation later if you
We
like.
must. I think we must. It's long overdue. Right. So as I can see on my screen, who's going to come first? Ayushi Pandey? Kindly make your interventions very brief.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, sir. And hello, Dr. Berry. First of all, thank you so much. It was such an intriguing and very elaborate. So thank you so much for this session. So I have 2 points basically. So ethics and value system, these are very subjective things, like right or wrong. You cannot, this is what I feel like, you cannot paint everything with single brush. So when you say like you bring in ethics into the leadership, how do you decide like a person is coming all with a preset value system, and then you want to align him with the maybe the ethics of the company or the organization that they are going. So how do you convince them? And second question is, there are conflicting situations, like where the person you are working with or for and your own value system are not aligned. Then how do you come in harmony in those kind of situations?
Right. So you brought up a really core question, Ayushi. Thank you for bringing it up. So I didn't talk about it in my remarks, but giving voice to values, when we did all those interviews and gathered all those stories, we started to see patterns in terms of what enables people to be able to act effectively. And we created what we call the 7 giving voice to values pillars. And the first one, I think, addresses your question. The first pillar is values itself. And it was this idea that, some people would say, as you were kind of saying, what if your values are out of alignment with your company's values? Some people would say that values are entirely relative. It depends on who you are, what your background is, where you live, what your religion is, what your politics are, whatever, your family. And so it's all relative. And so you really can't have this kind of constructive conversation. And there are other people who say, no. There are a core set of values that are absolute, and I know what they are. And it really doesn't matter what you think because I know what they are. And the issue there is that, either a position of total relativism or a position of total absolutism kind of precludes or prevents you from having the kind of values-driven conversation that I'm talking about. And so what we did is we tried to look at how can you do this? How can you frame it in a way that you can find that alignment? So what we looked at is in the research, both from philosophy, but also from psychology, there tends to be scholars have recognized that across time, across culture, across religion, there tend to be a core group of values that are pretty much universally shared. The philosophers call them hypernorms. And so it gives you this common basis to be able to connect. The other issue, though, is that it's a really short list. Okay, so they're very high level things like integrity or fairness or compassion, right? They're very high level. So what we try to tell people is when you encounter a difference, a values conflict, whether it's between you and your company, whether it's between you and a colleague or a customer, that you first want to ask yourself, does this rise to the level of one of these core values? Or is this more a matter of my personality, right? It's more just what I'm comfortable with. If it's just your personality, it may be something you're going to agree to disagree. But if it rises to one of those core value levels, then it is something that you want to practice and think about how to express. But you then need to think about, well, how can I express my views in a way that will appeal to the value that is likely to be shared? So I'm not going to use the vocabulary or guidelines that come from my religion or my politics or my family. I'm going to try and find those shared sort of values and guidelines that I can connect with. So one of the things that we talk about, if you look at most company codes of conduct, the stated values tend to be pretty consistent with these kinds of core values. Where you run into trouble is when the practice doesn't correspond to the stated values, right? And so that's when you're really going to usually run into these kinds of challenges. And that gives you an opportunity to look for ways to reframe it. So with GVV, sometimes when we're reframing to come to find that kind of alignment, we'll actually be making a case that may not even initially really go to values. You might frame it in terms of being practical. You might frame it in terms of risk management. You might frame it in terms of protecting your boss. You might frame it in a lot of different ways, even though it's driven by that core value. And so that's kind of how we try and address that issue of alignment, and we try and go at it pretty directly.
Thank you so much.
Right, Chinta, you may go next, but kindly make it very, very brief.
Let the others come in, so time is short. So let the students be coming in. So if there is time, then I will come over.
Sure. Rajiv Ranjan.
Yeah. So my question is that with reference to the Professor Kakoti's comment, I would like to continue with the work with Professor Mary, and I also have the same concerns regarding business ethics, and the creation of IIMs actually was, and the name nomenclature is very, very important. So they were not named as business management institutions and management institutes because of some reason by Professor and Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. And I would like to refer to Suka's 1994, a very important paper on epistemology.
Kindly make it brief.
Rajiv, can you have the question?
Very brief.
You have a question, otherwise.
Yeah, on the epistemological and ontological dimensions of the management theory. So sometimes we need to go on and also question those dimensions to get on to the, because business and society issues and sustainability issues are related to that. So if that interests you, ma'am, I would like to work together with you people on that issue. That is all I want to say.
Right. Thank you very much. We shall organize it. We shall.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll look
so
into that.
One last question, because we are running out of time.
Why, Achinta, why don't you?
Yes. Professor Mary, it's so enlightening to hear to you. My brief query or an observation is that we humans are very limited in our memory. And in decision-making dilemmas, this constraint that we have as far as our memory is concerned makes the decision-making process very complex. So can we simplify the decision-making process with the values and ethics parameter? And if so, how?
Well, I think if I understand your question, I think actually giving voice to values addresses that, because a lot of what it's about is building a habit. You know, if we go to every situation in this sense where we're starting from zero, it can be very difficult, especially in business activity where things move fast and, you know, you're making decisions and you're having to get things done. And so but if you look at them and you stand back, as you have the luxury of doing when you're in an educational setting, you begin to realize there are patterns. And so one of the things that we try and do with GVV is identify those patterns and help people think in advance and practice, so that when you are in those situations, it's not a matter of having to recall these elaborate kinds of frameworks and everything. It's more that you've actually internalized a way of expressing your own values that matters to you. This has become true to me in my own personal life. I tend to be an introvert. And one of the things that led me to create GVV is I felt like I have values, but I find it hard to express them. And what I found is that by working with people and having these conversations, I've realized there's patterns, and now it comes more naturally, and it means I don't have to accuse other people of being bad. I can be less emotional, and I can actually express the views. Not always, I'm not perfect at it, but I mean, I'm better at it because of this rehearsal. And I think that helps address some of the memory issue. The other last point I wanted to make is I know the theme of the conference is holism, harmony, and happiness. And one of the real reasons I developed GBV is because I wanted to figure out a way to be happy myself. And I knew that for me, it was important to be able to act on my values, but that I also felt because I was an introvert and a little risk averse, I thought, well, maybe I'm doomed to be, tormented by this, inability to express what matters to me. And what's been so valuable to me about GBV is that it helps address that. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think we have time for any more questions. I'm so sorry about that, but we shall have the conversation going. Mary, you'd be very happy that this conference, what we have done is we have planted saplings in honor of each of the speakers. So it's in the new campus. We have planted a sapling. We have called it a sapling of hope in celebration of life. And this is
wonderful.
So here is a small token from us appreciating what you are doing, the kind of love that you have from all of us here in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's the best acknowledgement you could have given. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mary, Thank you, Mary, for being with us. Please give my regards to Judith and Nancy if they are still in contact with you.
I am. I spoke with Nancy yesterday. I'll drop them a note.
Yeah. Please give them my regards, and I remember them very.
So, thank you very much. For people in India, it's a good night, and for you, please have a good day. Thank you very much. We shall be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you again. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.